At my daughter's wedding, in front of the guests, the music, and the lights, she smiled at the MC and said I was just an old family friend. Not her mother, not even an aunt, a stranger. Before I dive into what happened that day and why she didn't recognize me as her own, I need to say this. If you've ever been through something that made your heart drop into your stomach, you'll understand why I have to tell this story now. My name is Laura, I'm 48, and I've lived the last 20 years hiding my real identity from my only child. It wasn't because I didn't want her to know. It was because, years ago, I made a promise to my ex-husband, and breaking it would have meant losing her forever. When I divorced Daniel, our daughter Emily was just 2. Daniel came from an old money family with lawyers who could make anything stick. I had nothing, no savings, no family connections, and no chance of winning a custody battle. The only way I could keep seeing Emily was to agree to his condition. I could visit her, but never tell her I was her mother. To the world and to her, I'd be a friend of the family. If I slipped even once, he'd cut off all contact. So I played the part. I'd visit once or twice a month, wearing my faded work jacket from the factory, carrying a home-cooked meal in a lunchbox. Emily would greet me politely, the way kids greet a neighbor, and we'd sit at the kitchen table. I'd listen to her talk about school, about friends, about the trips her father took her on. She never called me Mom. I never let her see how much that hurt. I worked double shifts for years. Day shifts on the assembly line, night shifts cleaning offices. But I didn't just work. After hours, I studied. I taught myself business basics, accounting, and English for trade. I saved every cent I could, because I had a quiet plan. If I couldn't be her mother in name, I could at least build a life where I was strong enough to protect myself. And maybe, someday, her too. That plan took root. My small savings turned into a side business importing and reselling specialty goods. One client led to another. 10 years in, I was running an export-import company with contracts in 3 countries. I dressed in tailored suits for boardrooms, but changed into my old jacket before seeing Emily. She thought I was still working blue-collar shifts. I let her think that. It was safer. Fast forward to her wedding day. The venue was a 5-star hotel downtown, the kind you see in bridal magazines. Crystal chandeliers, white roses lining the aisle, a string quartet in the corner. I arrived quietly, wearing a simple dress and carrying my gift, a silver photo frame I had custom, engraved with lavender flowers. It matched the wild lavender I used to plant outside the little apartment we shared before the divorce, though she wouldn't remember that. The ceremony was beautiful. Emily glowed in her gown. Daniel looked proud beside her, and for a moment, I let myself believe I could just be happy for her. Then the MC invited the mother of the bride to the stage. My heart pounded. I'd been told I'd be introduced as a special guest, but still, a part of me hoped. Emily turned to the MC and, smiling sweetly, said, "Oh, she's just an old friend of the family." It felt like the floor dropped out from under me. A ripple of quiet laughter came from one of the tables. Daniel raised his champagne glass and looked away. I stood there, every year of sacrifice compressing into a single sharp ache in my chest. I didn't cause a scene. I smiled, nodded, and stayed through the toasts. I even clapped when Daniel spoke about how proud he was of his daughter. But inside, something shifted. It was the moment I realized Emily might never know who I truly was, not because I couldn't tell her, but because she didn't want to see me that way. After the cake was cut and the first dance finished, I slipped toward the exit. That's when it happened. One of my biggest corporate partners, Robert Hayes, a hotel chain owner, walked in. He spotted me, came over, and gave me a firm handshake. "Laura, what brings you here? Don't tell me you're the mystery sponsor behind this beautiful event." I saw Daniel's head snap up. Emily froze mid-sentence with a bridesmaid. Guests turned to look. Robert laughed. "You all didn't know? Laura's one of the most successful businesswomen I work with. She's been a major sponsor for events like this all over the state." The room went silent. I looked at Emily, whose smile had vanished. Then I said lightly, "Just here for a friend's celebration." Daniel's expression tightened. Emily's eyes searched mine, maybe for the first time, but I didn't give her anything more. I said my goodbyes and walked out into the night air. 3 months later, Daniel's real estate business hit a rough patch. His assistant called, asking if I'd consider investing. I politely declined. It wasn't revenge. It was clarity. For 20 years, I had been willing to be invisible for Emily's sake. But there's a difference between sacrificing for someone and erasing yourself completely. Years later, Emily reached out. She wanted to meet, to talk about the past. I agreed to coffee, but before we met, I wrote her a letter explaining everything, every visit, every lie I'd had to tell, every piece of my life she'd never seen. I told her I never stopped being her mother, not for a single day. Whether she believed me or not, that was her choice. That wedding day was the last time I stood in her shadow. And for the first time in decades, I stepped fully into my own life. Leaving that wedding was like walking out of a long, dim hallway into the open air. I could finally breathe, but it was sharp and cold, like stepping into winter without a coat. For weeks afterward, I replayed Emily's voice in my head, her calling me an old family friend, as if the word mother had never existed. I didn't spend those weeks wallowing. My life had always been about movement, and now more than ever, I needed to keep going. My company was in the middle of expanding into the West Coast market. We had just opened an office in Seattle, and I was commuting between there and Chicago twice a month. The work grounded me. Numbers and contracts didn't twist the knife the way personal relationships could. But life has a way of circling back to unfinished business. 6 months after the wedding, Daniel called me directly a rare move. His voice was smooth, almost too casual, but I caught the strain beneath it. His real estate development company had been hit by a downturn, and a major project was in trouble. He wanted me to invest. It was almost surreal hearing him pitch a deal to me, the woman he once forced into silence and anonymity. I listened politely, thanked him for thinking of me, and declined. My decision wasn't fueled by anger. It was simply the boundary I'd learned to keep. I thought that was the end of it. Then, one rainy afternoon, I got an unexpected visitor at my Chicago office. Emily. She looked different, more tired, like she'd been carrying something heavy for a long time. She didn't waste time with small talk. "Robert Hayes told me more about you," she said, her eyes locked on mine. "About your business. About who you really are." I kept my tone calm. "I am who I've always been, Emily. You just didn't have all the pieces before." She hesitated, then admitted that after the wedding she'd started asking questions. At first, Daniel brushed her off, but little inconsistencies in his stories made her doubt. She had even tracked down one of my early business partners, who told her about the years I spent working nights and saving every dollar while quietly building my company. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked. Her voice was quieter now, but it wasn't an accusation. It was a mix of hurt and curiosity. I explained everything: the custody agreement, the threat of losing her if I broke it, how every choice I made keeping my distance, hiding my success, was meant to protect her from the fallout of that arrangement. "You let me think you were nothing more than someone who stopped by," she said, her eyes welling. I wanted to tell her I hated it every single time, that I'd go home after seeing her and cry into a pillow, then get up the next day and work twice as hard because I believed someday she'd understand. But I knew those words would sound like guilt, and I didn't want her to carry that. Instead, I said, "I chose the only path that let me keep you in my life, even if it meant you never knew the truth until now." There was a long silence. Then she nodded slowly, almost like she was piecing together a puzzle she'd never realized was in front of her. She didn't apologize, not that day, but she didn't walk away either. In the months that followed, we met a few more times. Coffee in quiet shops, walks in the park. Our conversations were careful, like testing the strength of thin ice. She started asking about my work, my travels, the early days of the company. I told her about the nights spent in a one-bedroom apartment surrounded by shipping invoices and trade manuals, about the first big contract that felt like winning the lottery. Sometimes, she'd share little pieces of her life growing up, memories I wasn't there for. School plays, vacations, moments when she'd wished for a mother's voice in the audience but didn't realize she already had one, just watching from a distance. Those stories hurt, but they also healed something. One evening, while we were walking along the lake, Emily said, "I think I understand now why you left the wedding early." I just smiled faintly. Some things you can't unhear, and some places you don't stay once you've heard them. It wasn't a reconciliation in the movie sense. No tearful embrace, no instant erasing of the past, but it was a start. Meanwhile, my business kept growing. I opened a branch in Los Angeles and signed 2 major contracts with international suppliers. The irony was that Daniel's company, once towering over mine, was now struggling to keep its doors open. I heard from mutual acquaintances that he'd had to sell one of his properties to cover debts. He never called me again after that first failed pitch. Emily, however, kept coming back, not often, but consistently, on her own terms. She even visited my office once, meeting my team and seeing firsthand the world I'd built. I caught her looking at the framed photos on my desk, images of cargo ships, trade fairs, and my first storefront. "You really did all this on your own," she said softly. "With the right reasons," I replied. By the time her first anniversary came around, our relationship had shifted. We still had gaps, years of them, but the space between us no longer felt like a locked door. More like a hallway we were slowly walking through from opposite ends. Looking back, I realized something important. The moment at her wedding wasn't just a public slight, it was the closing chapter of the life where I allowed myself to be invisible. From that day on, I lived fully as myself, whether Emily accepted me or not. She may never call me mom, in the easy, natural way I once dreamed of. But she knows now, and knowing finally feels like enough. By the time 2 years had passed since Emily's wedding, our relationship had settled into something fragile but real. We weren't close in the way many mothers and daughters are, but we spoke regularly, met for lunch when our schedules allowed, and slowly filled in the blanks of each other's lives. She asked more about my business than I expected. I told her about the early days, how I'd rent small office spaces above restaurants because the rent was low, how the smell of stir-fry or baking bread would cling to my clothes during client meetings. She laughed at those stories, and it was the kind of laughter that didn't have distance in it. Still, there were things we didn't touch. She never apologized for calling me a family friend at her wedding, and I never asked her to. Some wounds don't need an apology to start healing. They need consistent proof that the person who caused them is willing to show up differently now. Meanwhile, my company was entering a new phase. We were no longer just an import-export operation. We were becoming a consulting name in the luxury goods market. Clients came to us not only to move products, but to authenticate rare items, antiques, jewelry, art. It was work I loved because it combined precision with instinct. It was on one of those assignments, traveling to appraise a private collection in New York, that I found myself thinking about my grandmother. She'd been the first person to teach me the value of small, overlooked things, how a simple-looking brooch could be worth thousands if you knew what to look for. That attention to detail had shaped my career, and I realized Emily didn't know any of that history. The next time we met, I brought her a small box. Inside was a vintage silver locket I'd bought years ago at an estate sale. It wasn't worth a fortune, but it was beautiful, with delicate engraving on the front. I told her the story of how I found it, how I'd kept it all these years waiting for the right moment. Her fingers traced the engraving slowly. "You kept this for me?" she asked. "Yes, not because of its value, but because it reminded me that some connections survive time and distance, even if they change shape." It was one of the few times I saw her genuinely moved. She didn't say much, but she wore the locket when we met again a few weeks later. Around that time, Daniel's business troubles deepened. I heard through acquaintances that he had sold several properties and was in talks to dissolve a partnership. One afternoon, Emily mentioned she was helping him sort through paperwork. There was no bitterness in her tone, just quiet concern. I nodded, offering no commentary. I'd learned that some things needed to play out without my interference. Then came an unexpected call from Robert Hayes, the business partner who had unknowingly revealed my identity at Emily's wedding. He was hosting a charity gala and wanted me to attend, both as a sponsor and as a guest of honor. I agreed, thinking it would be a straightforward evening of networking. When I arrived, I was surprised to see Emily there, standing with Daniel near the entrance. She looked startled when she saw me, then smiled, walking over with a glass of champagne in hand. "I didn't know you'd be here," she said. "I was invited," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. Throughout the evening, I noticed her watching as people approached me. Industry leaders, journalists, even a few public officials. She heard how they spoke to me, the respect in their voices, the way conversations paused when I entered a circle. It wasn't vanity on my part. It was simply the truth of the position I had built for myself. Later, as the event wound down, she found me near the balcony. The city lights stretched out behind her, and for a moment she seemed uncertain of her words. "You know," she began, "when I was younger, I thought success looked like Dad's life. The houses, the cars, the way people listened when he talked. But seeing you tonight, it's different. It's not just about what you have. It's how people look at you, how they trust you." I met her gaze. That kind of trust takes years to build, and you can lose it in seconds. She nodded, almost as if she was thinking of her own life. Then, in a quieter voice, she said, "I'm glad you didn't disappear, even when I didn't know who you were." It wasn't a declaration of love or a sweeping reconciliation, but it was more than I'd expected. In the months that followed, our connection continued to grow in small, steady ways. She'd call me for advice on things unrelated to business, buying her first home with her husband, negotiating a better contract at work. I gave her straightforward answers, the same way I would for any client, but underneath was the quiet satisfaction of finally being invited into her decisions. By the 3rd anniversary of her wedding, she invited me to a family dinner at her house. It was the first time I'd stepped into her home as more than a guest. On the wall, next to a framed wedding photo, hung a smaller picture of the two of us at the gala, both smiling. I didn't comment on it, but my chest tightened in a way that felt almost like peace. I knew we couldn't rewrite the past. But standing there, surrounded by the life she'd built, I realized we were writing something new. One conversation, one shared moment at a time. And for the first time in decades, the word mother felt close enough to touch. By the time another year passed, the distance between Emily and me had shrunk to something I could cross without hesitation. We still didn't label our relationship in public, but we spoke more openly in private. Sometimes she'd call late in the evening just to tell me about her day. Other times she'd send a photo from somewhere she and her husband were traveling. I'd reply with little details from my own trips, trade shows in Europe, meetings in Hong Kong, quiet weekends at my cabin in Wisconsin. Then one afternoon, Emily showed up at my office unannounced. She looked nervous but determined. "I'm thinking about starting my own business," she said as soon as she sat down. "Not big, nothing like yours, but something that's mine." I could see the flicker of both excitement and fear in her eyes. I asked her to tell me more. She explained her idea for a small interior design consultancy, specializing in sustainable materials and space optimization. She'd done research, drafted a basic business plan, even scouted potential clients. "You've been working on this for a while," I said. She nodded. "I just didn't know if I should tell you, or if you'd even think it was worth it." "I think it's worth it because you do," I replied. "And if you're ready to commit, I'll help you map it out." Over the next few months, we met weekly to go over her plans. I didn't give her money, that wasn't the point. Instead, I gave her the tools, contacts in the industry, advice on contracts, guidance on budgeting. I treated her the same way I would a promising young entrepreneur I was mentoring, with the added layer of wanting to see her succeed not just professionally, but personally. The launch of her business was modest but solid. She secured her first clients within a month, and I could see her confidence grow with every project completed. For the first time, I recognized a reflection of myself in her, not in appearance, but in the way she carried herself when she spoke about her work. Around this time, Daniel's name came up again, though not from Emily. I received a call from a mutual acquaintance in the real estate sector who mentioned that Daniel had reached out to him, trying to network his way into a new venture. The man hinted that Daniel might also be hoping to connect with me through business channels. It made me pause. Years ago, I would have been wary of any situation that could pull me back into his orbit. But now, I simply said, "If he's looking for me, tell him I'm not available." There was no anger in it, just a simple truth. A few weeks later, Emily invited me to a dinner she was hosting for friends and colleagues. It was a celebration of her business's early success, and she wanted me there. The evening was warm, filled with laughter and stories. At one point, one of her friends asked how Emily had learned so much about running a business so quickly. Emily glanced at me, then smiled. I've had a good mentor for a while now. It wasn't a public acknowledgement of me as her mother, but it was more than I'd ever expected in front of others. My chest felt heavy in the best way. Later that night, as we were cleaning up, she handed me a small envelope. Inside was a handwritten note. "I don't know if I'll ever be able to make up for the years I didn't know you," it read. "But I'm grateful for the years we have now." I kept that note in the top drawer of my desk. Whenever work got overwhelming or travel left me drained, I'd read it and remember why I'd endured those years of distance. The next spring, Emily asked if I would join her on a sourcing trip for her business. We traveled together for a week, visiting suppliers, meeting artisans, and walking through warehouses filled with reclaimed wood and vintage fixtures. Somewhere along those miles of aisles and design showrooms, the conversation shifted from business to life. She asked me questions about my childhood, about the choices I'd made in my 20s, about the risks that had paid off and the ones that hadn't. On our last night of the trip, we sat on the balcony of our hotel, watching the city lights. She turned to me and said, "I used to think family was just about who's there at the milestones, birthdays, weddings, holidays. But now I think it's more about who shows up when no one else is looking." I didn't respond right away. I just let the words settle between us. It was the closest she'd come to telling me she saw me as family in the way I had always hoped. When we returned home, Emily's business continued to grow. She landed a feature in a local magazine and started getting inquiries from clients out of state. She didn't need my guidance as much anymore, but she still called just to talk, to share victories and frustrations alike. It struck me then that the life I had built quietly, deliberately, and often alone had given me the ability to be the kind of support I'd once wished for myself. Not just for Emily, but for others I mentored along the way. I couldn't change the fact that, at her wedding, she'd called me an old family friend. That moment would always be part of our story, but it no longer defined us. What defined us now were the choices we made every day to keep showing up, to keep building something that felt like trust. And for the first time since she was 2 years old, I felt like we were finally walking the same path, not as strangers crossing occasionally, but as two people moving forward side by side. By the time 5 years had passed since Emily's wedding, the life I was living barely resembled the one I had before. My business had expanded into new markets, with offices in Chicago, Los Angeles, and New York. I was spending more time in boardrooms than airports now, delegating travel to my team so I could focus on strategic growth. Emily's design consultancy had also taken root. She'd grown her client list from a handful of local homeowners to large-scale projects for boutique hotels and restaurants. She was busier than I'd ever seen her, but she made a point to keep our lunches and check-ins. They'd become a kind of unspoken ritual, our own tradition, after years of missing the usual mother-daughter ones. One afternoon over coffee, she told me she'd been invited to speak at a sustainability conference. "They want me to talk about the process of starting small and staying true to your vision," she said, almost shyly. "You're more than ready for that," I told her, and I meant it. She had grown into her role with a confidence that didn't need my approval anymore. Then, unexpectedly, Daniel re-entered the picture. Emily called one evening, her tone hesitant. "Dad wants to meet with you," she said. "He says it's about a business opportunity." I didn't even have to think about my answer. "Tell him I wish him well, but I'm not interested." She didn't push. I think she already knew that door had been closed for good, but a week later, Daniel himself called. His voice was strained, but polite. He talked about a joint investment, a chance to collaborate. I listened quietly until he finished, then told him, "I built what I have without your help, and I'll continue without your involvement. I'm sure you understand." It was the kind of conversation I couldn't have imagined having years ago. Back then, I was in survival mode, careful not to provoke him for fear of losing my connection to Emily. Now, the balance of power had shifted entirely, and not because I'd sought revenge, it was simply the natural consequence of time and choices. A few months later, Emily asked if I'd attend an awards dinner with her. She was being honored for her contributions to sustainable design. The event was at the same hotel where her wedding had been held. Walking into the grand ballroom brought back a rush of memories, the music, the lights, her voice introducing me as an old family friend. This time, it was different. Emily met me at the entrance, took my arm, and introduced me to colleagues and industry figures as the person who taught me everything I know about running a business. There was no hesitation in her voice, no sideways glances to see who was listening. When she accepted her award, she spoke about the challenges of starting out, the mentors who had guided her, and the lessons learned along the way. And then she paused, looked toward my table, and said, "The most important thing I've learned is that the people who show up for you consistently are the ones you should never take for granted. Laura, thank you for always showing up. It wasn't Mom. It wasn't a public confession of our history, but it was a statement that told everyone in that room where I stood in her life." I felt a quiet satisfaction settle over me, the kind that doesn't need applause. After the ceremony, we stepped outside into the cool night air. Emily handed me the award she'd just received. "Hold this for me?" she asked. I turned it over in my hands. "You earned this," I said. "We both did," she replied. In the weeks after that night, our conversations shifted again. She began asking me more about my early years, not just the business, but my personal life before she was born. I told her stories about my first tiny apartment, my grandmother's influence, the mistakes that taught me more than any success. She listened without judgment, occasionally asking questions that told me she was connecting dots I hadn't even considered. One Sunday afternoon, she stopped by my house. We sat on the porch with iced tea, watching the light fade over the garden. Out of nowhere, she said, "I think I understand now why you never fought Dad the way I thought you should have. You were fighting in your own way." I didn't answer immediately. I just nodded, letting her words settle. It was as close as she'd come to acknowledging the sacrifices, without framing them as failures. Later, as she was leaving, she hugged me, not the quick, polite kind, but the kind that lingers. "See you next week," she said, like it was a promise. When I closed the door behind her, I realized that the life I'd built one decision, one quiet step at a time, had finally brought me here. Not to a perfect ending, but to a place where we could both stand on equal ground, no longer bound by the secrecy and distance of the past. And for me, that was worth more than any public recognition could ever be. A year after the awards dinner, the rhythm between Emily and me felt steady, even natural. We still had our separate lives. She was busy with her design firm, and I was navigating the next phase of my company, but we had settled into a closeness I never thought we'd reach. It wasn't about constant contact or big declarations. It was about knowing that when one of us called, the other would answer. That spring, Emily invited me on another sourcing trip, this time to the Pacific Northwest. We spent a week visiting suppliers, exploring small towns, and even hiking a trail overlooking the coast. One evening, after a long day, we sat on a bench watching the sun set over the water. She was quiet for a while, then she said, "I used to think you kept your distance because you didn't want me. Now I know you stayed because you wouldn't let go." I didn't say anything right away. Sometimes the best thing to do is let the truth hang there, unhurried. Eventually I told her, "I never stopped being your mother, even when I couldn't be called that." On the last night of the trip, she gave me a small wrapped package. Inside was a framed photo of us from our travels the year before. In the corner she'd written, "For the person who's been there all along." When we returned home, life moved forward in its usual way. Emily's business secured a large contract with a hotel chain, and my company finalized a merger that would expand our reach overseas. But beneath the busyness, I noticed something shift in how Emily referred to me. With her close friends and even a few colleagues, she started saying, "My mom," instead of Laura. The first time I overheard it, I felt something warm and quiet settle in my chest. Then came a moment I never expected. Emily called and asked if I would join her and her husband for dinner at their home. When I arrived, Daniel was there too. It had been years since I'd seen him face to face. He looked older, the confidence that once seemed unshakable now tempered. The conversation was polite, almost formal. He didn't bring up the past or the business opportunities he'd once pushed toward me. At the end of the evening, as we were saying goodbye, Daniel said, "You've done well for yourself, and I can see she's learned a lot from you." It wasn't an apology, but it was the closest I'd get. I accepted it for what it was, a small acknowledgement, late but still real. Over the months that followed, Emily and I began building new traditions. Sunday dinners at my house, a weekend getaway each year, swapping book recommendations. We didn't talk much about the years we'd lost, but I could feel the understanding between us growing stronger. One summer afternoon, while we were sitting in my garden, Emily said something that stayed with me. "You know, the wedding, I still think about it sometimes. I wish I could redo that moment." I shook my head. "If we changed that moment, maybe we wouldn't have ended up here. And here is good." That's the thing about life. It doesn't hand you clean slates. It hands you the chance to keep writing, even when the first pages are messy. Looking back now, I realize the years I spent hiding my identity weren't wasted, even though they were painful. They were the foundation for everything that came after: the discipline, the patience, the resilience. If I'd fought differently, maybe I would have lost Emily completely. If I'd stayed silent forever, maybe we never would have found our way back. But the path I took, however imperfect, led us here. There's a lesson in that for anyone who feels unseen in their own story. Sometimes the recognition doesn't come when you want it. Sometimes it comes years later, in smaller but more meaningful ways. A word, a gesture, a photo on a shelf, and when it does, it's not about winning, it's about knowing you never stop showing up. Now, when I walk into Emily's home, I see little signs of our journey together. The silver locket I gave her years ago sits in a dish by the entryway. The framed photo from our trip is on the mantel. And in her office, tucked between her design sketches, is the handwritten note she gave me after her first year in business. We can't rewrite the past, but we can choose what we do with the time we have left. For me, that choice is simple. Keep showing up, keep building, keep choosing connection over resentment. If you've made it this far into my story, maybe you've been through something similar. Maybe you've felt invisible in your own family or had to fight in ways no one else could see. If that's you, I want you to know it's never too late to stand in your own truth. And it's never too late to keep showing up for the people who matter, even if they don't recognize you right away. If you want to hear more stories like mine, stories about resilience, complicated families, and finding your voice, subscribe to Emily Family Tales. Because sometimes the stories we tell can help someone else see their own life in a new light.